Thank you all for being here. It's great to see such a crowd. My name is Margaret Fast, and I'd like to welcome you, along with my cohorts Jean Armstrong and Lisa Madsen, to the first reading series of this academic year. Before I turn the introductions over to Beth Joffrian, I'd like to extend a few thanks. First to Rand for being willing to share his book with us today, to Beth and her staff for providing this wonderful space that we all find ourselves in, to Clarissa Mansfield for the poster and the publicity for this event, thank you, to Jenny Oline and Kim Marsacek for arranging this is the first taping, video taping, that will be going into Cedar. So this is a new event for us. And finally to Robert Clark, who's doing the videotaping, and to Gary Malik for the equipment. So I'll turn it over to Beth.
Thank you, Margaret, and welcome to all of you to Heritage Resources and specifically Special Collections, the space that you're in now. Thanks for coming out on this blustery fall day and for joining us in a very special reading. It's truly an honor and a pleasure to introduce my good friend and colleague, Rand Jimerson. Rand is Professor of History and Director of Graduate Programs in Archives and Records Management at Western Washington University. He's held this position since 1994. So well into his 20th some year here. He's a fellow and past president of the Society of American Archivists. He's former president of the New England Archivists, which presented him with the Distinguished Service Award in 1994, just before he joined us. He's author of Archives, Power, Memory, Accountability, and Social Justice, published by the Society of American Archivists in 2009. He's editor of American Archival Studies, Readings in Theory and Practice, also published by Society of American Archivists in 2000. And the author of The Private Civil War, Popular Thought During the Sectional Conflict, published by Louisiana State University Press in 1998. His most recent book, and the focus of this presentation, is entitled Shattered Glass in Birmingham, My Family's Fight for Civil Rights, 1961 to 1964, published by LSU Press just this year. I know that this book was a labor of love for Rand. This research has really combined a number of his passions: archiving, historical research, social justice, and happily the collecting of archival material, some of which is bound for repositories around the country, including this one, Western Washington University, where I know it will go to good use by researchers interested in the civil rights movement. In our conversations, Rand has shared that the writing of this book has been a deeply emotional experience for him, as he's re-examined a very painful period in American history through the lens of his family's participation in the civil rights movement. And it's a real honor to have Rand share his truly unique perspective, I think, on the civil rights movement, and an honor to have you up here. Thank you, Rand.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and really an honor to be able to speak with you about some of the issues that come from my own experience and mainly that of my family. The book that I've put together is one that was done with the help of my, particularly my immediate younger sister, Anne. That's her on the right. And I coerced all 5 of the siblings to write brief stories about the impact of living in the middle of the civil rights movement for 3 years in an epilogue for the book. And so what I want to share with you today is some of that story and a little bit of the experience, and I do encourage you to ask questions when I finish, if there are any that you have. I want to start with the one part of the book that is totally different from all other parts of the book, and that's a deliberate choice. That is the prologue. And the prologue comes without this helpful visual and dating information. Jesus has no face. Looking at the damaged stained glass window, this detail shocks him. Most of the church windows have been blasted out completely, but in this tall centerpiece window, only a few bits of glass have been shattered, including the face of Christ. Almost as soon as he notices this, he shifts his focus back to the wider scene of devastation. As he crosses 6th Avenue from the park, he notices a confusion of people and vehicles. Police cars and fire trucks fill 16th Street Church. 16th Street, which is littered with debris. Several mangled cars sit askew with broken windshields, crumpled front hoods, missing doors. And I'll just skip through. There's a couple of pages of this story that I tell in the third person. And at the after the page and a half that I've skipped over, he looks across the street to Kelly Ingram Park. His mind flashes back to the images of police dogs and fire hoses used to subdue the demonstrators several months before. He pauses at the bottom step. Instead of leaving, he turns left, walking along the side of the church. A helmeted policeman holding a carbine with bayonet attached is looking at a small group of blacks, not at him. Firemen walk by, oblivious to a dark-haired white man in a faded suit, wrinkled white shirt, and narrow tie. Jim steps gingerly over bricks, cut stone blocks, broken glass, and spears of wood. He stops 20 yards from the jagged, gaping hole near the northeast corner of the church, the hole through which 4 lifeless bodies and several wounded victims had been carried only hours before. At his feet, he sees several panes of mangled stained glass amid the debris. He bends down and picks up one section of a broken window, twisted lead holding together small pieces of colored glass. Some fragments broken and missing. Someone should save this, he thinks, in remembrance. He picks up another rosette of stained glass and then a handful of smaller shards. He surveys the street, both directions. No one is watching him. He takes off his blue suit coat and wraps it around the shattered pieces of a stained glass window. He walks gingerly along the debris-littered 16th Street Church, across 6th Avenue, through Kelly Ingram Park, back to his waiting car, carrying stained glass mementos. Jim is the nickname that my father always used. In fact, my mother said she didn't realize his real name was Norman until their wedding. It was one of these whirlwind courtships. But the story that I tell about our experiences in Birmingham, Alabama during these 3 climactic years of the civil rights movement begin in this little house. This is a picture, it's actually a recent picture, taken 3 weeks ago when I was back visiting the old family homestead in Hopewell, Virginia, where I was able to give a talk to a small group of people about these experiences. But this was our house in Hopewell from 1958 until 1961. And it was in the front living room, the window on the far left of the image here, where we would sit for several months actually and have evening devotions, as my parents called them. My father was a chaplain at the Federal Reformatory near Petersburg, Virginia, just outside of Hopewell. And he had found out about the possibility that he had found out that a job opening had come up in Alabama for somebody willing to work full-time for a civil rights organization. He spent 6 months trying to convince my mother to move to Alabama. Every time he would say, "What do you think of moving to Alabama?" she would say, "Not much. I'm not interested," that sort of thing. But gradually over time, the conversations and his stories about some of the racial crimes that were taking place in Alabama, about the police beatings and the lynchings of black people, about the injustices of the racial situation there, built up and flowed out of our living room and throughout the rest of the house, I suppose one might say, of those stories. And it was at one of these evening discussions led by my father where my sister Ann, I was at this time 12 years old, she was 10 years old, and she finally said at one point, "But Daddy, if it's that bad, we have to go." And that was one of the things I think that tipped the balance in my father's very difficult decision to accept the challenge of going to Alabama. This is a family just at about the time he was beginning to consider this offer of moving to Alabama. My father, Jim Jimerson, my mother's name is Melva Jimerson. I'm the oldest of now 5. There were only 4 of us at that time. And then Ann, Paul, and Susie in that order. We were having fun in Virginia. We liked it. Sure, we were called Yankees. Sure, we had Boston accents at the time we moved to Virginia. But it felt comfortable. I was enjoying playing baseball 4 days a week at least, and so on. So there are a few stories about what it was like being Yankees in Virginia in the book here. And one of the coincidences that I just discovered a couple of months ago, after I had finished the book, after it was published, was that the person who had been the first director of the Alabama Council on Human Relations, Reverend Robert E. Hughes, had written a letter to my father in November of 1960, just at the time when my dad was beginning to think about the possibility of moving to Alabama. And I found this letter because my current research project is to work on a biography of Reverend Hughes. And this came about in part because 4 years ago he was given the Lifetime Peacemaker Award by the Whatcom Peace and Justice Center. And when he came to speak, I was invited to introduce him. I had in mind that after I finished this book about my family's experiences, I would work with him on a series of oral history interviews and help him essentially write his autobiography. Unfortunately, he passed away before my book was finished, before I could even broach this idea to him. But I began working with his wife, and I'm now actually on a professional leave for this year to continue the research and writing of his biography. But I found out that he had written a letter to my father here in 1960, telling him essentially, if you're thinking about this, it would be a great opportunity for you to consider taking this job. So this was part of this choice that my father had to make. Actually, it was a choice that I think he had secretly made as soon as he found out this was a possibility. It just took 6 months, as I said, to convince my mother. And I'm not sure it was not so much convincing her as having her give in on that matter. So by the spring of 1961, we were ready to go to Alabama. My father had accepted the job, and 1 week after he accepted the job, 2 buses with Freedom Riders were attacked in Alabama. One was burned, and their famous photograph of the burning Freedom Riders bus in Anniston, Alabama. The second bus made it to the bus station in downtown Birmingham, and Bull Connor had notified his police force that they should not bother showing up for a while after the bus arrived, to give the crowd a time to greet them in true Alabama style. And several people were very badly maimed and injured in that, nearly to the point of death. So that was the first indication, I think, that this was not going to be an easy job that my father had just 1 week before accepted. But by the summer of late July of 1960, we drove from Virginia down to Alabama. We began to get acquainted in our neighborhood. This is actually a snapshot of our house, and those of you with keen eyesight will notice the date on the old snapshot of July 1962. No, it did not snow in Alabama in July of 1962. It did snow, though, for a day in February of 1962. So you see how long it takes me to get pictures to the printer. This is actually, it looks like an aerial view, but this was taken from the street level. Our neighborhood was on a very steep hillside, so that the houses on the opposite side of the street, you had to climb up quite a few steps to get to their front doors. For ours, you had to go down the hill to get to the front door, so that the street level was about even with the top of the roof of the house. At any rate, when we arrived in Virginia, in Alabama rather, I decided I was not going to be known as a Yankee anymore. I was going to fit in to the neighborhood. And so there's a passage here in which I recounted conversation, because the boy who lived in the house just to the right of our house from this view was my age. His name was Mike Ham. And when I first met him, he asked, where are you all from? They saw that we had just moved in. And I tried to mimic the drawl that I had deliberately resisted picking up in 4 years in Virginia, and tried to drawl out something like, well, moved here from Virginia. To which Mike replied, whoa, that's way up north. Y'all are just damn Yankees. So I don't know. I couldn't win on that score. The bulk of this story then that I'm trying to tell in the book is how these events affected our family, myself particularly, because I'm the only one whose opinions I can say with any certain measure of accuracy. But also I got stories that my sisters and younger brother had written or told me about. But I mainly based my research on, being an historian, on archival research, on oral history interviews, including 4 interviews I did with my father before he died in 1995, and also a couple of interviews that other historians had done with my dad before he passed away, and some interviews I did with my mother, and some things, documents, family papers, and notes. I'll talk about a couple of these later. But it was based on archival research, but it's a book without footnotes. And that's awfully hard for an historian to write a book without footnotes, because you want to prove that this is true. So I did, at the request of the publisher, include some endnotes with sort of references to certain quotes and statements that I took from documents where there might be concerns about copyright or liability and so on. But basically it's a story in which my father told so many stories about his work and what he did that I thought it was a pretty safe bet to take his correspondence, his quarterly reports, his oral history interviews, and turn his words and modify them slightly into conversations, into the stories that he would have told us at the dinner table at night, while we were driving in the car, various places, and so on. So this is my appeal as an historian and an archivist for clemency in terms of citation. Of course, most of us around the country and around the world are familiar with these 2 images of Birmingham taken during the demonstrations of 1963. And it's worth noting at this point that my father had been in Alabama almost 2 years at the time the demonstrations took place. He was involved in the book. I tell some of this story as well. At one point in the fall of '62, he was asked by some of the white moderates in Birmingham to go to Atlanta and meet with Dr. King and his staff and try to ask them to postpone their plans for Birmingham demonstrations until after a city election that was going to take place in the spring of 1963. The thought being that if there were a demonstration before the election, it would so turn moderate white opinion against the demonstrators that they would vote for essentially the powers that be, including Bull Connor. It's a complicated discussion, but it's something that I write about it in the book. At any rate, my father was given this responsibility, and he always thought that that was what convinced Dr. King not to come, even though he could not meet with Dr. King. He had a long conversation with one of my father's friends and colleagues from Virginia, Wyatt T. Walker, who was by then working with Dr. King. At any rate, when the demonstrations did begin in 1963, Dr. King asked my father to set up a meeting where he could meet with some of the white clergymen in the city and explain to them some of the purposes and goals of the demonstrations, what they were trying to accomplish. And my father had a couple of meetings with King, including one lunch meeting that is documented in one of his oral history interviews. But he mostly worked with other civil rights leaders, some who are well known for those of us who've studied a lot of civil rights history. The leader of the activist community among blacks in Birmingham at that time was Reverend Fred Shuttlesworth. And my father, on a number of occasions, worked with him on a variety of issues of concern relating to police brutality and the rights of African Americans in the city. During the demonstrations, while the business leaders in the city were trying to come to an accommodation with the demonstrators over desegregation of certain facilities, my father was able to set up a meeting with David Vann, who was a young white attorney of a moderate disposition in the city, which made him a flaming communist by many people's reckoning at that time. And between David Vann and Reverend Andrew Young, who was one of Dr. King's top assistants during that period of the demonstrations. And so just the three of them, my father, Andrew Young, and David Vann met together late after midnight in the parsonage of a white Episcopal minister who was out of town, and that was one of the factors that contributed towards the discussions that eventually resolved the demonstrations. But this was a time when we were seeing, not so much on the local news as on the national news, images of our city. Well, we were in Homewood, which is a suburb just over the mountain from Birmingham, but images of our city such as people saw around the world. And as part of this work that my father did, his job was to go around the state and find out if there were any violations of the civil rights of African Americans, any acts of violence, any problems that needed to be addressed that could be brought to the attention of the U.S. Civil Rights Commission. So my father was in frequent communication with the Civil Rights Communication and several of its staff members in Washington, D.C. But he also worked with local chapters of the Alabama Council on Human Relations, helped them organize meetings with the goal mainly of education on matters relating to race and race relations, but also a goal of communication. So one of the things that over and over in his letters, in his reports, in what he said about his work, my father emphasized that his job was opening communication between the races. He was able to do this to an extent that many people later said that he was probably the only person in the state of Alabama who was equally trusted, and that's a word that has to be judged on a sliding scale, of course, but equally trusted, equally respected by the white moderates in the community and by many in the black leadership. So that was his role, was to be a sounding board and to convey from one group to the other the ideas, the concerns that they had, to help them work towards resolving these difficult challenges. This is a photograph we found in the American Baptist magazine at the 1964 convention of the American Baptists in Atlantic City, when my father was trying desperately to find another job to get out of Alabama by that time. He happened to be in the crowd right behind Reverend King and Coretta Scott King, and of course the Senator Hubert Humphrey, who later became the vice presidential candidate. So it's the only picture I have of him with some of these civil rights leaders that he worked so closely with over the years. Well, we were kids. We did kid things. We had a good friend of my parents who had a small swimming pool in her backyard, and so for Sue's 7th birthday in 1962, we had a swimming pool party. And then in July of 1962, a year to the day after we moved to Birmingham, a younger brother, Mark, was born. My parents said at that point they began attending some classes that they called Planned Parenthood, and I didn't think they needed to plan for that. It seemed just to happen. But there are family stories. Anne and Sue one year won the best Halloween costume, since this is the day before Halloween, the Halloween story, won the best Halloween costume in Homewood for their age range, and they dressed up as a witch and a cat, and there's a detailed description of making those costumes that Anne contributed to the book. So if you want to know how to make a good witch costume, this is the book for you. My mother was a very important player in all of this, even though she dragged her heels about going to Alabama. This is a copy of an article that we discovered in the family files in the attic in Cape Cod, Massachusetts, when we were helping Mother clean out her house, at which point I was helping her decide which things to save and which things were not worth saving. And she began telling her friends, every family should have an archivist. It's really a useful thing. It's, I think, the first time after 25 years or so in the profession that my mother understood what I did for a living, or had some idea about it. But Anne had always said that Mom had written an article for a contest with Red Book magazine, some essay, and in going through the papers we found this essay, which is called Immunizing Children Against Prejudice. My mother gave her name, and then in parenthesis, as was the custom at the time, said Mrs. Norman C. Jimerson. So that'll tell you a little bit about how long ago and far away this story came from. But one of the factors that my mother was involved in, because of the stress under which we lived, we began getting death threats by telephone. We began getting just what one friend called hate calls, just harassment phone calls where the phone would ring, you'd pick it up, and it'd be just, you might hear somebody breathing at the other end, but it might be just pure silence, just as a way of harassing us. Focusing for some time on her pregnancy and on having a new baby gave my mother a great deal of respite from this, a great deal of protection from some of these dangers. But one of the other factors that I found in going through the papers that the family had is handwritten notes that my mother had written out in pencil on small bits of paper. And it turned out over a couple of different weeks during this period, she had written down things that she had heard from people about how they were reacting to our family's experiences, or things that she heard on the telephone. So for example, one of those series of comments that she wrote out had to do with a time at which we had just moved to Alabama and began attending a Baptist church, because my father was, after all, an ordained Baptist minister. And after he had given a guest sermon or two and filled in the pulpit for the pastor while he was out of town, after a couple of months, news about my father's job working for a civil rights organization began to get around, and people from the church came to him and told him it would be better for everybody if he stopped coming to church. At one point, one of them said, it's okay if your wife and children want to come, but if you come, it will just be disruptive. People will be upset because, and they didn't use the terms, but a commie, forgive the language, but it's the language of the time, nigger lover is a term that was frequently used that we heard quite a bit. So here's a minister. There's a whole chapter about our search for a church that we could attend, because we were asked not to attend 3 churches and decided on our own that 2 others that we visited weren't suitable before we went back to one of the churches that had asked us not to attend. So it was a time when my mother, as well as my father and us as children, were under quite a bit of stress from that. And during one of the other times when my mother jotted down notes, it had to do with some of the telephone calls we were getting, and this is by near the end of the time we were there in 1964. And this is, I'll just read a few lines of the transcription that my mother wrote down afterwards. This is from one of the callers. To Paul, is your mother going to sing a spiritual in church? No answer. Well, is she going to sing a spiritual? Melva, don't you speak to my child. Don't speak to my child like that. Voice, are you going to sing a nigger spiritual? Melva, no, but I will if you want. Voice, no, we don't want that. I'll be glad to sing one. I understand your husband has the countenance of a dog, and some more degrading words she wrote in parentheses. Do you know my husband? No, but I understand he looks like a dog. If you don't know my husband, then you have no right to say anything about it. He's a fine Christian man. He's sold out to the niggers. If you don't like Negroes, you better check your Christianity. You sold out to the niggers too. You're supposed to love everyone. That's all I have to say. I hang up. This is a housewife who goes beyond the usual range of activities for a woman of that time, and had a great deal of courage. So here we are with Mark. This is the picture Mark wanted on the cover of the book. The publisher would not relent. They had to have my parents. In all the 3 years we were living in Alabama, we don't have a single family snapshot or studio portrait like this with the parents and the children. So I guess they decided that 5 was enough to fit in one picture. But one of the things that we were also able to do in 1963 and 64, Ann and I were able to go to a summer camp in New Hampshire that was run by one of my father's seminary classmates, and he made special scholarships available for us to attend that. We were able to get out of town for a hot month of the summer, each boys' camp and girls' camp at different times. And in 1964, it must have been, as I tried to research and match up the timing of things with stories that Sue and Paul said, that the 2 younger kids, Sue and Paul, attended an integrated summer day camp at Miles College, the historically black college in Birmingham. And so they were able to have one of the very rare experiences of being able to be in an integrated setting for a period of time. About as close as I got to that was a rock and roll party at someone's house in the spring of 1964 when I discovered the Temptations, and I still can't hear the Temptations without thinking of that experience. For a shy kid, it was bad enough being at a party, let alone a party where there was a lot of potential tension in the air, but that was one of the good memories I bring back from there. And of course, the starting point for this and the title of the book, Shattered Glass in Birmingham, is taken from the September 1963 bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church. Most of us know of the 4 young girls who were killed in the church bombing. Another girl, sister of one of the dead girls, was blinded and is still seeking some compensation from this horrible crime. But not everyone outside of Birmingham knows that on that same afternoon after the church bombing, there was a spate of violence that led to the shooting deaths of 2 young African-American males. 12-year-old Virgil Ware was riding on the handlebars of his brother's bicycle. They were going over to pick up a second bicycle that they could use on their paper route. 2 white Eagle Scouts, having just attended a states' rights racist rally outside of Birmingham, rode by on a motorbike, pulled out a handgun, and shot Virgil Ware to death. And on that afternoon, during some of the demonstrations and protests in Birmingham, a police officer shot Johnny Robinson, the young man on the right, in the back as he was fleeing the commotion. So it's important to remember, along with the 4 little girls about whom Spike Lee made a movie, that there were also 2 young boys killed on that same day. My father was invited to speak at the funerals of the 2 boys held separately. He had gone after as soon as possible after these events took place to visit the families of all of the deceased as a minister. He thought that was what his calling was, to offer grief counseling, to offer a show of sympathy and concern. And he and my mother attended the one joint funeral of the three of the 4 girls, at which Martin Luther King Jr. spoke. Afterwards, my mother said, "Well, who was that speaker?" And my father said, "That was Dr. King." And she said, "Oh, I never see a picture of him in the newspaper, so I never knew what he looked like." But they were very much involved in that. We as a family went over on one occasion to Virgil Ware's family house, a small shack in a very impoverished neighborhood, and some of the impact of seeing that level of poverty and seeing the suffering of that family is something that I needed to put in the story. So that's another part of the story. But there was healing that did take place. And almost a year after the bombing in August of 1964, they had a rededication of the church that had been repaired and somewhat refurbished. My father is over here, second from the left. The pastor of the church is on the far right, Reverend John Cross. And the woman in the choir in the back row on the far right is Maxine McNair, whose daughter Denise was one of the victims of the church bombing. The photographer who took this picture was her husband, the father of Denise, Chris McNair. I want to get back to a personal story, and this is not about my run-in with the FBI. But in 9th grade civics class, well, first I should say in 9th grade, in the fall semester, we took Alabama history, in which we read in our textbook about the heroic organization that helped end the evils of Reconstruction and save the South from further ruin and rampage, and that, of course, was the Knights of the Ku Klux Klan, who are great heroes of Alabama history. In the spring semester, instead of Alabama history, we had a course called civics. And I don't think they teach those kind of courses anymore. But this was a course where you learned what it was like to be a citizen of a democracy, what it was like to be a meaningful participant in what was going on in the political system and in social activities as well. And we were required to read this book Masters of Deceit by the FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover. And I want to just read a little bit of a passage of this, and again, I apologize for some of the language that I had to use in this book, but it was the language that I was hearing quite a bit. I was to be part of a panel discussion to talk about this book, so we were each given parts of the book to explain, and I did that. On the morning of our panel discussion, I told Mom I felt sick and couldn't go to school. But she told me I couldn't stay home just to avoid a difficult situation. You have to face up to it, Randy. 4 of us on the panel took turns talking about Masters of Deceit. We sat in a row at the front of the class, our desks turned to face the other students. I sat on the far left, with a teacher at her desk near the window at my far right. One of the other panel members, John Calhoun, had earlier asked me why I wasn't cheering when President Kennedy was assassinated. That was what happened in the school, was there were loud cheers when the news of the Kennedy assassination came over the loudspeakers. When it was my turn, I just tried to report what Hoover had written without saying whether I agreed with it. When his turn came, John Calhoun strongly endorsed Hoover's anti-communist attacks. He said the book showed how communists used agitation about issues concerning women, veterans, racial and nationality groups, farmers, and trade unions to get people upset with the government. This trapped people into supporting the Communist Party. John said, "It's clear from Hoover's book that anyone involved in human relations or civil rights work is a communist. And the Negro organizations like NAACP and CORE and the Black Muslims are all communists." Following our presentations, the teacher asked if there were any questions for the panel members. After a couple of questions from the class, I leaned over and raised my hand. I want to ask John a question. What evidence, here's the historian to be, what evidence do you have that all of these civil rights groups are communists? Because from what I can see, most of them are led by Christian ministers. Immediately, the room buzzed with surprise, confusion, anger. The teacher turned red in the face and spluttered, "You're all wet. You don't know what you're talking about." She was practically screaming at me. John's pale face turned purple. He was yelling, but I couldn't hear what he said. Other students turned to talk to each other. I didn't know what to do. I sat still and waited. When things began to quiet down, Greg Beasley raised his hand. Greg was the smartest kid in the class. I know because he beat me out in the spelling bee that year. He said, "Actually, the Black Muslims are not communists. They want separation from whites, not integration." Greg briefly explained the main ideas of the Black Muslims. He was the only other person in the class who said anything at all that contradicted Hoover's book and the segregationist views that John had expressed. Within another minute or two, the bell rang to end the class. I walked to my next class, geometry, in a daze. I didn't want to look at anyone. As I sat down, one boy who had been in civics class walked to my desk and loomed over me. He asked, "Are you really a nigger lover?" I didn't know what to say. I couldn't say yes or no to such a question. Should I object to his use of the word nigger? Should I try to explain why I opposed discrimination? How could I respond? I paused for a moment or two and the bell rang to begin class. I finally said, "I try to love everyone. I think that's what we should do." That's the only answer I could give to his question. I couldn't pay attention to anything else in geometry class. Well, that wasn't that unusual. I hoped the teacher wouldn't call on me. I wondered, why did he ask that question? Was he trying to pick a fight? Or did he perhaps really want to know what I thought? Was he curious about talking to someone with different ideas from his own? I couldn't ask such questions, and I would never find out. That's the end of a chapter called Nigger Lover. In 1964, my father was able to get a job in Kalamazoo, Michigan at Kalamazoo College, which had two benefits. One, it would get him out of the heated cauldron of racial politics and strife in Alabama. And secondly, it would allow him to earn enough money and to get a tuition waiver from Kalamazoo College to send his children to college. And I was about to enter 10th grade. In 1992, my father was invited to return to Birmingham for the dedication of the Civil Rights Institute, which was built directly across the street from the 16th Street Baptist Church, and also directly across a different street from Kelly Ingram Park, where the fire hoses and police dogs had been turned on the demonstrators in 1963. And this is a panel, one of many panel discussions that they had during the 3 or 4 day ceremony for the dedication of the Civil Rights Institute. On the far right here is David Vann, the white attorney who my father had worked with during the years in Birmingham. Vann had, before this photograph was taken, had been elected and then unelected as mayor of Birmingham. So a white moderate was replaced actually by Birmingham's first black mayor in the late 1980s. The next, second from the right is my father. Third from the right is Reverend Robert E. Hughes, the man who had preceded my father. In the middle, the African-American gentleman there is Reverend Herbert Oliver, who started an organization which was devoted to reporting on incidents of police violence and abuse of African Americans. And he had been one of the people my father had worked with during this time in Birmingham. In September of last year, the Congressional Gold Medal was awarded to the 4 girls killed in the church bombing on September 15th, 2013. And almost to the day, 50 years later, the award ceremony for this Congressional Gold Medal was held in the Statuary Hall of the Capitol Building in Washington, D.C. President Obama had signed the legislation for this congressional recognition. And in the picture with President Obama, looking over his shoulder in the blue suit, is the current African-American woman who is the congresswoman from the Birmingham district of Alabama. Things have changed. On the right side of the picture, seated is Maxine McNair, the woman I pointed out from the choir, and behind her, her younger daughter, Lisa McNair, sister of Denise McNair, who was one of the victims. And that's the gold medal. My sister Ann lives in Washington, D.C. Mark and Sue had come down from Massachusetts at that time because we were doing something the day before. And so 4 of the 5 siblings those of us were able to attend this ceremony in Statuary Hall. And what I noticed immediately is that on a panel, or sort of a raised platform that included the Republican and Democratic leaders of both the House and the Senate, looking down upon the proceedings was the one seated figure in Statuary Hall, Rosa Parks. And the reason that my brother and sisters and I were in Washington that week in September of 2013 was that we were making a donation of stained glass from the 16th Street Church bombing. This is the stained glass that my father had picked up off the street on the day of the bombing. In 2002, my mother had agreed to donate one of the leaded panes of glass to the Birmingham Civil Rights Institute, and we did that in 2002. And after quite a bit of discussion, my I have to admit it, I convinced my brothers and sisters, especially Sue, the last holdout, that this glass should be donated to the Smithsonian. And one of the reasons for that decision is actually on the last page of the book. In February 2012, I watched live TV coverage of the groundbreaking of the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture. As President Barack Obama talked about the value of such a museum, I heard him say, "I want my daughters to see the shackles that bound slaves on their voyage across the ocean and the shards of glass that flew from the 16th Street Baptist Church and understand that injustice and evil exist in the world." And I decided then that that was what we needed to do with that glass that we still had in our family's possession. It did not belong to our family. It did not belong to my father. It belonged to the country and to all of us. So that's the title of the book, Shattered Glass in Birmingham. I was trying to get them to accept Stained Glass Memories, but they wouldn't go for it. So now you know what the real title of the book is. And with that, I hope there's time for a few questions. So put my glasses on so I can see you all. Thank you.
Ray, could you talk a little bit about your current research with the Hughes?
Yeah, a question about my current research. Reverend Bob Hughes, the first director of the Alabama Council on Human Relations, ended up being forced to leave Alabama in the fall of 1960. He was a Methodist minister and had been assigned as his ministerial responsibility to work with this new organization, the Alabama Council on Human Relations, in 1954. He recruited to the organization a young African American minister in Montgomery to be a vice president of the local chapter of the Alabama Council, and that, of course, was Reverend King. And so he worked closely with Dr. King during the bus boycott. I'm sorry, it wasn't a boycott because boycotts were illegal, but the bus protest of 1955 to 56. In 1960, he had spoken with a New York Times correspondent, Harrison Salisbury, who was writing an article about the racial climate in Birmingham, and Hughes helped him with making contacts for people he could talk to get behind-the-scenes information. And when the article came out in the New York Times, it caused a hullabaloo because Birmingham was very jealous of its reputation, and this was the most damning possible indictment of the climate of racial fear and hatred that gripped the city. And Hughes was called. They found out that he had, through telephone records, that he had been in contact with Salisbury. He was brought before a grand jury. They required him to produce documents, membership lists, and records of the Alabama Council for the court to investigate. After conferring with his attorneys, he said no, thank you, because he was a polite man. And he ended up spending Labor Day weekend of 1960 in jail for contempt of court. Eventually that was thrown out, but it also, gave impetus to a White Citizens Council spin-off called the Methodist Laymen's Union, which was a group of Methodist lay people who were fighting against desegregation, against integration. And they raised questions about why the Methodists should be supporting somebody doing this work of a communist in their midst. And essentially, he was able to negotiate an alternative that instead of losing his ministerial credentials, he would be reassigned to a Methodist bishop in southern Rhodesia in Africa as a missionary. He went there with the idea of working on race relations issues. That was his portfolio as a missionary. And after 2 years in southern Rhodesia, both Hughes and his bishop were kicked out of southern Rhodesia for reasons not stated. And Hughes went to northern Rhodesia, which later became Zambia. Southern Rhodesia, of course, is now Zimbabwe. And so he spent the remaining 2 years of his 4-year assignment in Zambia. And so that's the part of the story that I wanted to tell. But what I didn't realize until I met him 4 years ago for the second time here in Birmingham was that he had spent most of his career in Seattle. He had worked for several years for the Department of Justice in the Community Relations Service in Atlanta, and then transferred to the Community Relations Service of the DOJ in Seattle. And his job from the late 70s until he retired in the early 1990s was to travel around the Pacific Northwest, particularly Alaska, but also Oregon, Idaho, Washington, and Montana, I believe, and to investigate hate crimes, Nazi skinhead organizations, and a variety of concerns. So I've found some very interesting things about that. The bulk of the papers that his wife has donated to Western concerned his work here in the Pacific Northwest. And so once those have been received and prepared for research use, I think these will be a superb resource for students and faculty and anyone else interested in the history of hate crimes and issues relating to racial and ethnic violence in the Pacific Northwest. Thanks. Other question?
I've got one.
Okay.
And this is probably more for you on a personal level, but as you're writing about this time, and it was a terrific book. I really enjoyed reading it. But your siblings all had different experiences,
Yeah.
and it seemed that you had consulted with them some as you went through. Did you find that you had really different views on some of those episodes?
We remembered some things differently, but not entirely so. And Anne and I were both old enough to be aware of what was going on, to understand what was happening, to know from our father what, from an intellectual standpoint as well as just an emotional standpoint, what was happening. For the younger kids, Paul and Sue in particular, Mark was 2 years old when we left, so he has no memories, but he did write what I think is a wonderful essay in the epilogue about the impact of these family stories that came before his birth. But I think we didn't have any totally different ways of thinking about things. There were some things that I remember one way and convinced me were really happened a different way, so we tried to work that out. But 14 years ago, Anne had tried to get she had really started this project, if you will. I think we had both been wanting to write somehow about our experiences for almost 40 years before we started that. And she started by trying to get each of us to write short vignettes, stories like the one, and one of the ones I wrote was about being called a Yankee because I was from way up north in Virginia. And we had a few of those vignettes that we started off, but we just lost steam, and none of us did more than 2 or 3 of those, I think. So she was hoping we could do that just for ourselves as a family project. And finally, in, I guess it was in 2011 or summer of 2011, 4 of us were together on Cape Cod visiting Sue and Mark. And Anne said, you know, the 50th anniversary of the church bombing is coming up pretty soon. We should try to get something done to coincide with that as a remembrance of that. And I finally, at some point then, said, okay, I'll do it. If nobody else is going to do this, I'll do it. And if you want to protect your reputation, give me some good information that I can use for it. So I contacted the publisher of my first history book, LSU Press, just because I was lazy and knew that they would recognize my name at least. And they said, if you can get a manuscript to us by the end of August of 2012, we might be able to get it into the queue for publication in the fall of 2013, around the time of the 50th anniversary. So I don't recommend this to anyone, but I spent 4 months and wrote 500 pages of manuscript and had my blood pressure spike to a level that I thought my new blood pressure cuff was defective until I went into the doctor's office. So I don't recommend trying to write on that kind of a blitzkrieg, but that was sort of what happened. Yeah. Damani, you had a...
Yeah, it was really kind of a segue question. So your family your father had good reasons for getting out of Alabama, although his commitment to civil rights didn't seem to have flagged. But how did you guys feel about leaving? I mean, at that time, then moving into relatively sort of docile Michigan.
Yeah.
I mean, as kids, were you regretting it, or were you so glad to finally be back in Yankee land or something where you belonged?
Well, I was actually born in Michigan and didn't start moving around the country until I was 2 months old, when my father graduated from the University of Michigan and moved to New England to attend seminary. So for me, that was a homecoming of sorts. Unfortunately, I never left Alabama, because when I went to summer camp at the beginning of August of 1964, I knew my father was writing about jobs and he was trying to get a job, but nothing had happened. And I was at camp and got a letter, "Dear Randy, your dad's got a job in Michigan." And so I never went back to Birmingham until 1992 after that. And that meant I wasn't in the car when they crossed the line into Tennessee, pulled over and waved goodbye to Alabama. And I didn't have that sense of closure, if you will. But, you know, I had trouble making friends, really. I had a couple of good friends in Birmingham, but I was pretty much afraid to talk to anybody about the things that were important in my life, which had to do with, in part, the civil rights movement, because I couldn't imagine dating a girl who didn't think the way I did about those issues. I couldn't imagine having a close friend who I knew disagreed with me. So I never asked Tony if he agreed with me. I just said, "Okay, Tony, we're buds," and we hang out together. I don't even remember Tony's last name. But so that was, for me, it was something that I felt a little bit safer. Of course, I was only a year or two away from getting into another problem where I was on the minority, and that was arguments about the war in Vietnam. And I was one of 3 or 4 kids out of 30 in a classroom who thought that was a bad idea in 1966 and 67. So I pretty much made my father used to have a saying that if people don't disagree with you, then you must be doing something wrong or not doing something right. That he thought if you were doing what, and this is his way of terming it, what God wanted you to do, you'd be unpopular. I don't know if I did what God wanted me to do all the time, but I was pretty unpopular for a long period of my time in my life. So maybe it worked. One of the things that I mentioned that I actually have got this is the water bottle from the Appomattox Regional Library in Hopewell, Virginia, and I spoke there 3 weeks ago. And I had been back and visited Hopewell a couple of times since we moved away in 1961. But as I was getting my notes together and getting ready to speak, this taller gentleman, kind of a scruffy looking guy, tall, wearing a baseball cap, long stringy gray hair, a gray beard, came up to me and said, "I'm going to test your memory." I said, Tim Groom. This is one of my 6th grade classmates I hadn't seen in 53 years. Had seen my name, recognized it, and showed up for that talk 3 weeks ago. So that was pretty exciting. Thank you very much for coming. I appreciate your time.